developing nuclear weapons. In January 2020, Iran declared its own withdrawal from the agreement, raising fears of the rapid development of its nuclear capabilities. As the United States was experiencing the worst nuclear crises since the end of the Cold War, history suddenly became the present. In August 2017, two influential commentators, one a Republican, the future National Security Advisor to President Trump, John Bolton, the other a Democrat, the former White House Chief of Staff under President Clinton and CIA Director and Secretary of Defense under President Obama, Leon Panetta, suggested in unison that the U.S.-North Korean standoff over the development of Kim Jong-un's nuclear and missile program was the worst nuclear crisis to hit the world since the standoff over Cuba. In February 2019, Vladimir Putin joined the fray, declaring that he was prepared for a new Cuban-type missile crisis and threatened the United States with supersonic rockets to be installed on ships and submarines off the American coast. He repeated the same statement in February 2020. 1 month earlier, in January 2020, after the U.S. assassination of Iran's architect of clandestine warfare, Qasem Soleimani, and Tehran's announcement of Iran's complete withdrawal from the nuclear deal, the U.S. media compared President Trump's nuclear gamble with President Kennedy's actions in the Cuban Missile Crisis. The references to the Cuban Missile Crisis have shown no tendency of disappearing from the world political scene and media anytime soon. The return of nuclear weapons to the center stage of international politics inevitably brought back memories of the nuclear stand over Cuba. Can we prevent the emergence of a new nuclear showdown, or at least resolve it without a nuclear war, by re-examining the history of the crisis? In this book, I argue that there is indeed much to be learned from the experience of those who created and then resolved the crisis. There is an additional reason to revisit that history. With the world sliding back into the nuclear brinkmanship that characterized the 1950s and early 1960s, it is essential to educate new generations about the dramatic events of that era in a way that addresses the uncertainties of today's world. The body of literature on the history of the Cuban Missile Crisis is truly enormous, but there are major gaps both in the coverage of the crisis and in understanding it as an international rather than a solely American affair. The deep dive into the history of the crisis began in the 1960s with Robert Kennedy's 13 Days, a memoir of the Cuban Missile Crisis. It remains very popular, but the appearance in the public domain of tapes of the ExComm, an acronym for the Executive Committee of the National Security Council convened during the Cuban Missile Crisis, debates, made secretly by President Kennedy and apparently available to his brother when he was working on his book, challenged many established truths about the process of decision-making. Later research showed that his account was often self-serving and inaccurate with regard to the role played in the crisis by Robert Kennedy's nemesis and rivals, such as Secretary of State Dean Rusk and then Vice President Lyndon Johnson. Major progress has been made by historians, political scientists, and journalists since the publication of Robert Kennedy's book in 1971. The classic work of the Harvard historian Graham Allison, later joined by Philip Zelikow on decision-making during the crisis, became a must-read for generations of international relations students throughout the world. The work done in the 1990s by the American historian Timothy Naftali and his Russian colleague Alexander Fursenko contributed enormously to our understanding of the decision-making process in Moscow, while an excellent journalistic investigation by Michael Dobbs presented the bottom-up story of the crisis, which involved dozens, if not hundreds of thousands of people in the three belligerent countries. The Cuban side of the story, long unavailable, has become known in recent decades with the publication and eventual translation into English of works by Cuban historians. But no matter how many academic and popular studies have been written and published in recent years and decades about the Cuban Missile Crisis, the dominant narrative remains the same. John Kennedy refused